Hey everybody, my name is Adam Neely. I'm here answering all of your questions about bass and music in general. So let's get started.
Question and answer time with
Matthew Van Ness writes, I have a question for a Q&A. I've watched a few of your videos, but not terribly many, so it's possible that this has been asked and I just haven't seen it, but do you have perfect pitch? If you do, I'd be interested in hearing how you discovered it, and whether it has functioned as a hindrance or help regarding your development of relative pitch and general musical aptitude, or if it had any effect at all. If not, I'd still be interested in hearing your thoughts on perfect pitch and the extent to which you think it's useful in the musical world.
So, no, I do not have perfect pitch. You read the thumbnail. Am I curious to know what it's like? Sure. Do I think that it would enrich my music listening experience? Of course. Would I be a better musician if I had perfect pitch? That's debatable. So on the surface, yeah, it might seem like it would be pretty useful to have perfect pitch, the ability to identify notes purely based upon sound alone with no reference. So if I was to play this note, if I had perfect pitch, I'd be able to correctly identify this note as a D just by listening to it. That does seem pretty useful, but here's the thing. I have a pretty developed relative pitch, which means that now that I know that this is a D natural, I'll be able to hear any other note and relate it back to this note and calculate the difference. So if I was to hear this note, for example, I would be able to hear the minor third relationship between this and the original starting pitch of a D natural. If I was to apply my knowledge of the theory of music, I would know that B is a minor third down from D, so the second note that I heard is in fact a B. This is why I think listening for intervals and chords and developing a very strong relative pitch is so useful, because it more accurately reflects how we listen to music. We don't listen to music as this sort of atomized collection of notes with no relationships to one another. We're hearing chords, we're hearing colors, we're hearing the relationships of notes to one another. Perfect pitch by itself does not explicitly give you that. It just gives you the ability to identify notes. And I think relative pitch actually can be even more important. Check this out. If you had a good relative ear and also a developed understanding of music theory, you'd be able to correctly identify this chord progression as a 2-5-1 chord progression. You'd be able to hear the functions of each one of those chords. You'd be able to hear that the first chord was a minor 7, which is the 2 in whatever key it's in. You'd be able to hear the second chord as a 5-7, which is the 5 in whatever key it's in, and you'd be able to hear the resolution to the 1 major 7. If I told you now, as somebody with a developed relative ear, that that was a 2-5-1 in the key of E flat, you'd be able to tell me what all of those chords are. Aha, okay, we're in the key of E flat. That is, of course, an F minor 7, a B flat 7, and an E flat major 7. Now, if you had perfect pitch, you would probably be really annoyed right now. Why would that be? So it turns out that all of the examples so far in this segment have been on a keyboard that's tuned a half step sharp. So this is actually what a 2-5-1 in the key of E flat would sound like. Now, for those of us with relative pitch, this doesn't actually sound that much different. It might sound a little bit darker, but we're conceptualizing it the same way. It's still a 2-5-1 in the key of E flat, even though it might not have come out that way. But for people with perfect pitch, there was a disconnect between what I was playing and what I was saying. It's kind of like if I do a hue rotation in Final Cut. Now all of the colors are all slightly off, in balance with one another in the same way, but they're all slightly off. These examples with the piano being kind of tuned incorrectly do come up in the real world. There are examples of people who learn perfect pitch on pianos which have not been properly tuned, and so when they listen to any other music with their perfect pitch, it's like all the music in the world has been hue shifted. Basically what I'm saying with this is that I think that perfect pitch definitely does add to the musical experience. It adds another layer, but I don't think it is absolutely necessary or even in certain circumstances desirable, because it adds a layer of complication and translation to something that is fairly relative to begin with. I think it's more important as a musician to learn to listen to the differences between notes and develop a good relative ear. Having perfect pitch doesn't guarantee you the ability to listen to music this way. So for me personally, I haven't been in any situation where I would prefer to have perfect pitch rather than the relative ear that I've developed. So no, I don't have perfect pitch, and never really missed it.
Jack N writes, Unrelated question for the Q&A. I want to get into listening to jazz, but I don't know where to start. I know that I like jazz, but there's so much of it that it becomes intimidating to get into. How would you suggest someone start listening to jazz?
So approaching jazz music for the uninitiated can be fairly daunting, and I've linked in the description a pretty decent article from Smithsonian Magazine, What to Listen to and Watch For When Enjoying Jazz, which kind of breaks down how to listen to jazz. Because for the most part, it's not super self-explanatory, and you kind of need to know how the moving parts actually move in order to know what the heck is going on. Jazz has many genres, but the genre I think you should check out first is hard bop, which came after bebop. Hard bop is a style in the 1950s and early 60s, and a good album of hard bop to check out is Relaxin' with the Miles Davis Quintet. Typically speaking, you're going to start out with the melody, or the head of the tune. You would typically borrow this head melody from a song that was popular at the time. So in the case of Relaxin' with the Miles Davis Quintet, they open up with If I Were a Bell from Guys and Dolls. After the melodic instruments finish playing the head melody, then everybody in the ensemble takes turns improvising solos that are directly based upon the harmonic progression of the melody that you just heard at the beginning. What this means, and it actually kind of varies depending on what style of jazz you're listening to, but no matter how chaotic it gets, everything always relates back to the harmonic form of the melody that you hear at the beginning of a piece of jazz music. So if everything is sounding fairly disjoint, like everybody is playing different songs, try listening for that underlying chord structure and try humming the melody to yourself. You'd be surprised at how quickly everything sort of clicks together. There is a very definite and rigid structure to it all. Once everybody is done soloing, then the original melody returns. Now, this is definitely not the only way that jazz is structured by any stretch of the imagination, but this is typically how it's done in a fairly conservative hard bop style. I recommended Relaxin' with the Miles Davis Quintet because it follows the style pretty well. Now, the most popular jazz album of all time, also by Miles Davis, is Kind of Blue, but it doesn't follow this rubric quite to the letter. Instead, it uses a slight variation of this idea. Instead of the musicians improvising around a harmonic scheme based upon a head melody, they're instead basing their melodic choices around what we would call modes or scales. This is sometimes called modal jazz, one of the many, many different kinds of jazz, each with its own unique approach to improvisation and composition. So I hope that tiny primer and also the Smithsonian Mag article gives you a tiny idea of what to actually listen for when you're trying to do a deep dive into the wonderful, terrible world of jazz music.
DD writes, what's the point of analyzing something in such a depth as, for example, the first question? Let's be honest, no one thinks like that when they're writing a song. Is it just because you can?
In my last Q&A, I spent 8 minutes talking about an F minor 7 chord, the second chord to the chorus of Stevie Wonder's Sir Duke. Now, 8 minutes in YouTube time is an eternity, but in the grand scheme of things, 8 minutes isn't actually that long. I spent the first minute talking about how Stevie Wonder probably thought of the chord as he was writing it. He was looking for a chord that created drama, and so he picked a chord that was out of the key that accurately harmonized the melody that he wrote. The rest of the time was spent giving context to this choice and how we actually might experience the sound of this F minor 7. It's this idea of contextualizing things that actually has made me think more and more about comparing music theory to history. You don't actually need to know the history of the modern world to live in it, but that doesn't mean that you aren't profoundly influenced by history. I just finished listening to the 20-hour Dan Carlin hardcore history take on World War I, and it really made me think about how influenced the modern world is based upon the events of World War I. You can think of how the Ottoman Empire and the subsequent divvying up of lands in the Middle East between French and English colonial interests led to a century of sectarian strife, which directly led to 9/11 and our current modern era. You don't need to know that, but you are still profoundly influenced by it. It's the same exact thing with music theory. You don't need to know why we have 12 notes. You don't need to know why we have major chords and minor chords, but that doesn't mean that you aren't profoundly influenced by all of the developments over the past millennia that have led to the music that you now listen to and that you now create. When you analyze music, what you're trying to do is you're trying to piece together all the strands that come together to create a piece of art that you are influenced by. And through that knowledge, you have a greater understanding of your relationship to that piece of art, that piece of music. Ultimately, what I was trying to do is take the functional relationship of F minor 7 in Sir Duke and tie it to Sir Duke, the functional harmony of Duke Ellington. I was trying to show you the connection between the history of Duke Ellington's music and the history of Stevie Wonder's music, which seemed fairly apropos because that is the name of the song, Sir Duke. So you don't need to know any of that, but that doesn't mean that you aren't influenced by it. That doesn't mean that you aren't influenced by the collective shared history of functional harmony. And that's why I'm super excited about this music theory history analogy, because I think it can go quite deep, and I'm gonna probably talk about it in future Q&As and maybe future videos. So that's why I spent 8 minutes talking about the second chord to the chorus of Stevie Wonder's Sir Duke.
Christian Nally writes, when the music vlog gets 10 times the views of the whole performance.
A big part of my channel has always been what it's like to be a musician, and so what I want to do with these gig vlogs is give an accurate portrayal and a compelling portrayal, essentially a documentary of what it's like to play these sorts of gigs in New York City and elsewhere. And a big part of that is playing to rooms with very few people. It presents kind of an interesting situation because yes, there weren't that many people in the audience at the time at that particular gig, but now almost 100,000 people have seen that particular gig. That's mind-boggling to me. I definitely do not feel this way, but it almost seems like the value of the gig to society is more about me telling the story about the performance rather than the performance itself. It's a kind of hyper-real situation I've cornered myself into, where it's more real if I film it and tell a story with it than if I just play the gig. And I'm not quite sure how to feel about that, but I am enjoying doing this sort of thing, so for the foreseeable future, there will be more gig vlogs.
CJam writes, hey Adam, I just recently have become a fan of your channel and love all of the theory and interesting aspects of music. My question is, what do you think of the brass band Lucky Chops? They've gotten pretty popular over the last couple years and I very much enjoy their music. I'm very interested in your take on the theory behind their mostly original songs. Keep up the good work and quality memes.
Fun fact, I went to school with both Josh Gowell and Josh Holcomb of the band Lucky Chops, and Josh Gowell played first trumpet in my big band piece, Exigence. So when I say that I enjoy the band Lucky Chops, just keep that in mind because I might be slightly biased. So I really enjoy the band. I saw them first maybe like 3 or 4 years ago at Radagast Beer Hall in Williamsburg for a July 4th show. And if you've ever played any shows in New York City, you would know that the millennial hipster crowd does not really dance. Instead, they sort of sway back and forth in this sort of soporific trance, but that was definitely not the case when Lucky Chops Brass Band played Radagast Beer Hall. As soon as they started Danzo Kuduro, everybody was standing up on all the tables and dancing, and it was a big ruckus event, and the security had to come in, the door guy had to come in and tell everybody to get down, but everybody was getting down too much to get down off of the tables. I like that pun. I'm going to include this in this video. Get down. So I think the popularity of bands like Lucky Chops Brass Band comes down to people's desire to dance to live music, because the sound of a brass band is really unlike anything else. It's powerful and loud, but more importantly than that, the way that the sound actually hits your body, from my experience and also listening to everybody else's experience, it's quite different than listening to music through speakers. So Lucky Chops is definitely at the foreground of this narrative, this brass band renaissance that's very much tied to dance music, and I'm very excited to see what they do with it going forward, and honestly check them out if you ever get a chance because it's a good time.